Okay, so this is the third faction, my personal favorite, not just because of the color, but because they're just insanely weird to play. This is the Woodland Alliance, and the Woodland Alliance is all these little furry creatures that we see in the forest represented by the suits of the clearing. So the rabbits, the mice, and the foxes. So these guys have decided they've had enough of the Marquise de Cat, they've had enough of the Erie Dynasty, and they're ready to control their own destiny and are preparing to rise up to take back the forest for the small folk. So, what makes them special? First and foremost, they have these little tokens called sympathy here, and that's how they'll get their victory points. So placing that one will get me a victory point, placing that one will get me one, and so on. And you can see above here, this is the cost to place them. So one card matching the suit of the clearing I want to place it in, and it does need to be next to a place where I already have sympathy. I can't just spread it randomly. When I get into this tier, it's a little harder to place, the 2 matching cards and then 3 matching cards and so on and so forth. If the clearing that I'm placing sympathy into has 3 warriors of a single other player, then this cost goes up by 1. So it's very hard to get sympathy into a clearing where there's already a decent military presence, again, as you would expect. So these are these sympathy tokens. What special abilities does the Woodland have? The Woodland Alliance has outrage in their favor, so if you move into a clearing where a sympathy token exists, or if you destroy sympathy as an opposing player, again, in both of these cases, it's an opposing player, the person who does that must add a matching card from their hand to the supporter deck, which is right here. This is different from your hand of cards, and I'll get into that in a minute. If they don't have a matching card, they have to show you their hand. You get to pick one as the Woodland Alliance and add it to your supporter deck, so that's pretty strong. And then in guerrilla warfare, this is what makes the Woodland Alliance so much fun. We talked about battle in the in the first video. Attacker takes the high die, defender takes the low, but with the Woodland Alliance, they take the higher roll as the defender, and the attacker takes the low. So the Woodland Alliance always gets the higher die when fighting other players. So that's their powers. However, they are very, very difficult to get into the game and deploy, and I'm going to walk you through why that is. So here's the flow of their turn. In Birdsong, they first revolt if they're going to, and then they can spread sympathy. They can only revolt when they have a base to place. They must be able to place a base, and they must be able to revolt in that place. So they'll spend supporters from their supporter deck, not from their hand. But when they successfully do this, they're going to remove all the enemy pieces there. Tokens, buildings, warriors, of everybody. Wipes it out completely, and it becomes theirs. They place the base that matches, and if they don't have that base, obviously, they can't revolt there. And when they do that, for every clearing they have matching that suit, including that one, they'll get to place a warrior there. And then they'll also place a warrior in their officer's box. Now, it's worth noting that the Woodland Alliance has fewer warrior pieces than most, so the balance between warriors and officers does come into play, and I'll get into that in a minute. So, if they can revolt, they may. They quite often won't be able to, but once we move on to that, then after any revolts are done, then and only then they can spread sympathy. So you can't obviously spread sympathy and then revolt. By spreading sympathy, again, you use your supporters, and you pay according to the cost on the sympathy track, and then you place a sympathy token adjacent to a sympathetic clearing, unless you have no sympathetic clearing, obviously. And again, the supporter suit must match the clearing you're playing into. This is, again, where the suits of the clearings and the suits of the cards come into play. So this is basically your networking, your people. This is how you power your sympathy tokens and your revolts. And this deck is exceedingly important. And of course, people that piss off your sympathetic clearings will pay into that and help you keep that engine moving. So during daylight, you can do these 3 things as much as you want. You can craft, and obviously, as you would expect, sympathy is how they craft. So where they have sympathy in clearings, that determines what they're able to craft based on where their sympathy is placed. So if they're in 3 fox clearings, they have 3 fox worth of crafting, and so on and so forth. Mobilizing lets you take cards out of your hand, place it in your supporter stack, again, to keep that engine going. And then you can play a card out of your hand where you have a built base to get a warrior into the officer's box, and officers become important in the evening, so I'll come around to that next. So in the evening, This is when you can actually do things with your warriors. All of this is card movement and so on. And of course, this is getting your sympathy tokens and your bases in play. But this is where you move your warriors around. You can do as many of these 4 actions as you have officers. So if you only have 1 officer, you're doing 1 thing. 4 officers doing 4 things. But 4 officers is 4 warriors you don't have on the field. But if you have no officers, can't do anything. So there's your balance. There's your big decision point for the Woodland Alliance. Move, we've talked about. Battle, we've talked about. Recruit, you recruit at bases. So that's where they place. Again, the eagles recruit at their roosts, and the cats recruit at their recruiter stations, but we recruit small folk. The Woodland Alliance, recruits at their bases. And then lastly, organize, and this allows you to reclaim a warrior from the board and put sympathy there. So you've trained up a resistance cell, and you're heading on out of there. Underneath the sympathy tokens are additional draw cards, and of course at the end of your turn you'll draw a card. For every card symbol you'll get an extra card and discard down to 5. That's of course common across the factions. We've talked about how you use the bases. Nothing really fancy here. If you lose a base, it's penalizing to your supporters deck and your officers, so it's very demoralizing. So once you have a base on the board, protect it. The Woodland Alliance is very much sort of a late game player. It spends most of the early game getting sympathy spread around, maybe a revolt here, maybe another one, but largely just kind of getting into position to really just destroy people's plans at the worst possible time, and really flip the script on them. And they're a lot of fun to play. They're also pretty easily countered again because the bases, they do recruit at their base. They don't have a ton of warriors, so if you can keep the sympathy down and pay that cost, again, removing sympathy, you can attack tokens. You can attack the cat's wood. You can attack the woodland's sympathy, just like any other piece. And in fact, it's a victory point when you remove it, but you're going to pay an extra card every time you do so. So it's a determinant of how contained to keep them versus how much to let them be a threat in the later game. And that's pretty much it for the Woodland Alliance. 3 factions down, 1 to go. I'll be right back.